right. So, today, introduction to Redux. We're going to go through the slides like normal, and then instead of having a challenge for you guys, we're going to do kind of a challenge together instead of just throwing you guys off the deep end in Redux. It's a little bit tougher than that. So, Redux is extremely difficult. I'm not telling you this to be scared of it. I'm telling you this because don't beat yourself up, because you're probably not going to get it today. You're probably not going to even get it the next couple days. Okay? It's very, very difficult to understand at first. But once it starts to click, it's really not that bad. It's just the initial understanding is pretty tough. And it will ultimately save you a lot of trouble, and it's actually easier to use than just using React by itself. That's why it's there. It's not there to make React more difficult. It's there to help you. Unfortunately, you guys haven't had the opportunity to build out a full website in just React to fully understand the issues you run into with passing state and props and stuff around in a normal React application. So some of the benefits that Redux gives you, you guys aren't going to fully appreciate or understand necessarily. You just have to kind of go off my word for it that, trust me, it saves you a lot of trouble. With that said, I would encourage everybody to try and implement it into your final project. Don't be scared of it. If you actually just try and implement it, yeah, it's going to be a little difficult. But the only way you're going to learn it is to use it. If you don't use it in your final project, then you're probably not going to learn it while you're here. So, and you may or may not get a job doing React, but if you do get a job doing React, there's almost 100% certain you're going to be using some form of Redux. There are similar things, but the concepts are across all the different libraries, and Redux is the most popular library. So what the hell is Redux? Anybody tell me without reading the slide?
Just know that it holds state in one place.
That's it. Redux pretty much contains your state in a centralized location. And just like component state, state's just an object. It's just a fancy object for storing information. When that object gets updated, it will force your component to re-render and display the up-to-date information. Why do you think it's important, or what do you think the benefit is of being able to store the state in a centralized location? Because any component could access it directly. Okay? With standard React on its own, if you have a component that's nested 5 or 6 components deep, to get information from the top component to that nested component, you have to pass it through props through every single component. And as your application grows more complex, that can get very frustrating and very confusing. Like, where the hell is all this information coming from? It could be coming from multiple different components at different levels, and it can become a real pain in the butt to manage. And then you have the issue of sibling components that are sitting at the same level. This one might have the information that one over here needs, or one nested over here needs. And there's no direct, easy way to get that information across siblings. So you have to move the state up a component, which is a huge nightmare to do. This eliminates all that. It puts all your state in a centralized location that any component could access directly. Just like in normal state in React, state is read-only. You cannot directly change state, which gives you a couple benefits. One, it causes you to have better practices, so you're not directly changing your state unexpectedly. You have to go through a process to update the state. And kind of along the same lines, changes are made with pure functions. They take in some data and then return some new data without ever directly manipulating what the original state was or what the original data passed in was. So, long story short, with all these 3 points that may or may not make a lot of sense, the key thing to remember is that Redux creates a centralized location for storing your state information that can be accessed anywhere within your application. And I don't think it's in the slide, but as a side note, Redux refers to its main state object as a store. Think of it as like a grocery store. It stores all of your state information. So you'll see we'll be referring to it a lot as the Redux store instead of Redux state. But it's the same thing. This is the most important slide out of all of the slides in this slideshow, and maybe just all the slides put together. Once you understand this cycle, this process, you can understand Redux. Now, it's a lot easier said than done, but this is everything you need to know of how to update the Redux state. So this is literally the most important slide here. So let's go through this process. So your React app decides it wants to change state, okay? Either from a button click, someone typing into an input, any number of things, any kind of event, anything happening that would normally change state, okay? So your React app triggers a state change. The React app will then call an action creator. An action creator is just a function. That is it. Action creator is a function. The action creator function returns an action. An action is just an object. So standard curly brackets, key value pair object. Nothing fancy about it. Every action must have one property. And that property is type. Has to have a property of type to tell it what type of action it is. What type of action are you trying to perform? You can also put any other information in the action that you want. You could send information along with information that you want to update your state with, or you could just send nothing else with it. It could just be like, hey, this type of action triggers a certain state change. Most of the time, though, you'll be sending extra data along with it. Most commonly, you'll see people call it payload. So the property name will be payload, which will be some kind of object containing some data from the server or from wherever else. It does not necessarily have to be called payload, although that will be the most common thing you'll see it called. Does anybody know what payload means?
No.
Just in general terms.
In general terms?
Yep.
Like something being transported?
Yeah, like a truck has a payload on it. You see a truck going down the road with a bunch of wood for building houses or whatever. That wood is the truck's payload. Okay, it's taking something somewhere else. So it's the same thing. Payload is the exact same thing here. So payload is just some data being transferred from one place to another. And once again, the property name doesn't necessarily have to be payload, with a slight asterisk on that. But there's nothing directly inside of the core Redux library that says it has to be called payload. The only property name that matters in any action is type. There has to be a type property. Other than that, it does not matter. All right, so action creator is a function. It returns an action that is just an object that at least has the property of type in it. We're going to pretend this square is not here for right now, so we're going to just kind of cut diagonally across to the reducer. So when this action creator function returns an object, that object gets passed into the reducer. The reducer is just another function. This function gets whatever the current state is and your action object. Inside of the reducer, there's a switch statement. That switch statement checks for whatever type that action is. And then based on what type the action is, it returns a new state. Okay? So it returns a new object that updates your state to whatever values you want it to be. So this reducer returns that new state, and then that new state goes into your app, and your components that are using any pieces of that state will update and display the new information. So in summary, action creator is a function. That function returns an object, which is referred to as an action. That action is passed into the reducer, which is another function that ultimately returns whatever the new state is going to be. An important thing about this is we're going to learn how to build reducers with a switch statement in it. The switch statement is going to check action.type to see what type the action is. And then based on that, it'll return a new state. That's not the only way to build a reducer. That's how I'm going to teach you to build a reducer. And that's probably one of the most common ways to build reducers, but it doesn't matter what's inside the reducer function. All the Redux knows is it's a function that it's going to call. And when it calls that function, it's going to pass its state and your action. Whatever returns out of there is the new state. It doesn't know or care how you determined what the new state was. Okay? Once again, we're going to do it with the switch statement, but that's not the only way it's done or can be done. Redux has no idea what content is inside the function. It's just calling the function. So I'm going to show you how to set up in a very particular way, but through your journeys throughout development, either looking at examples or getting a job somewhere where they use Redux, they might do it differently. There's all kinds of different ways of doing it. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it. Using a switch statement is just kind of the most basic, straightforward way. It's not going to seem that way, but it's actually one of the easier ways to handle it. All right, so let's put some code behind all of this. Any questions on the Redux cycle? It's easy, right? You guys got this? All right. So in normal circumstances, React is React and it does not contain Redux. If you use something like the Facebook Create React app, the only thing that app has in it is React. It doesn't have anything else. So to use Redux, you have to install Redux. Redux for React comes in two libraries. There's the core Redux library. Redux is not exclusive to React. Redux could be used in standalone. It could be used in just a plain old regular JavaScript project. You could just use Redux and jQuery, Redux and core JavaScript, Redux and Angular, Redux and Vue. You could use Redux anywhere. Redux is its own thing. It just happens to work really well with React because React is already state-based. So Redux fits really well with React, but they are not associated. Okay, so there's the core Redux library, and then there's the library that was made to connect React and Redux together. So that's React-Redux. So anytime you're setting up Redux in a project, you have to install those two libraries. With the LearningFuze React Starter, Redux is already there, so we don't have to do this. But any other boilerplate code, starter code you're using may or may not have it. So it's something you want to check. Like I said, the Facebook version of it does not already have Redux in it. I'm sure there's a lot of boilerplate codes out there that do. If you're using some other starter project other than the Facebook one or the LearningFuze one, you can easily check what's included in their starter code by checking where?
JSON
package JSON file. Okay, that'll tell you everything when you type npm installed, everything that's already going to be installed. If you don't see Redux in there, then Redux is not included. Plus, they should have documentation that tells you what it is. But easier than reading through all the documentation, just shortcut to the package JSON. So one more time, the LearningFuze starter that we always use already has this. So we won't be doing this. But
what happens if you do it?
Still just update it.
Just update it.
Yeah. That it won't hurt anything. First thing you do when you're setting up Redux is set up the file structure. All right. Create a folder called actions. Inside of actions, there is a types file. This types file will hold quote unquote definitions for every type. Now, a definition for a type is just a string, like, update to-do list, just in a string. Okay? But we save all these strings into variables and then use those variables instead of directly typing out those strings in multiple places. Why do you think we do that? Why would we save just a string into a variable and use a variable every place instead of just typing the string every place?
Avoid mistakes.
Avoid mistakes and potentially less typing as well, but mainly to avoid typos. That might sound like a silly reason to add an extra step, but I guarantee you will make mistakes if you just use the string. And I'll show you in more detail what that actually means when we actually start playing around with this. Index file. This index file inside of the actions folder. This holds all of your action creators. This holds all the functions that return actions. Remember, actions are just objects. So it holds all the functions that return objects to tell your Redux state how to update. That's the actions folder. Then we have the reducers folder. The reducers folder will have an index file in it, and it will have separate files for each individual reducers. Each reducer is responsible for a specific part of state. Okay? You can potentially just have one reducer, but normally you want to divide your state up a little bit more than that.
So for each property you want?
No, not each property. Each similar, for example, you might have a user reducer that handles user data. Then you might have, if you're building a to-do app, you might have a list reducer that deals with all your to-do items, updating and getting the to-do list from the server. Those are two completely separate things inside of your app, so you separate them out with separate reducers. Now, ultimately, it all gets saved to the same state object, but you differentiate them a little bit by making them with different reducers. You can have as many reducers as you want, or once again, you can do it with just one reducer, and if that's easier in the beginning, that's fine. But on a large-scale application, if you had one reducer, it would end up being hundreds of lines long with hundreds of different types, and it would be a pain in the butt to manage. Inside of the index reducer, we put some code in there that takes all the reducer files, runs them through a function called combine reducers, and this creates what's called a root reducer. The root reducer is what we actually plug into Redux to create our Redux store. And we will talk more about that in a minute. So, folder setup. Actions folder. Inside actions, there's an index file and a types file. Reducers folder, index file, and then any reducer files we need. For the rest of these slides, we're going to take all the stuff I just talked about, and we're going to create another clock example. Now, the reason I chose to do another clock example is to show you the difference between using component state and then using the Redux state. It's the same clock example that we built when we learned about class components and state for the first time. That link should link you to those original slides. So we're building the same clock. This time we're just doing it with Redux. And would you normally build a clock with Redux? Absolutely not. The setup for it is way more work than it's worth. Redux is for scale, for handling a normal size to large application. Okay? I should show you guys the folder structure for the new portal we're building and all the different reducers and shit that are in that. It's mind-boggling. So this is an example of a reducer. Asterisk, but the first thing we do inside of a reducer is we create a default state. This is all the values that we want this part of the state to be set to when the app first starts. you want to make sure you set default values to everything you're going to use. Every property should have a default value. In this case, the only property we have is current time. Then we build the actual reducer, which is just a function, and that's the whole point of this file. So we're just going to directly export this function. When Redux calls this function, we're never going to call this function. Redux calls this function. And when it does call it, it's going to pass whatever the current state is for this reducer, and it's going to pass us whatever action was sent out. Whenever an action is sent out, it's called dispatched. You know, like 911 center dispatches, you know, law enforcement or firefighters or something to the scene of crime or fire or whatever like that. They dispatch out the police guys. That's the same as what happens with an action. Your action creator dispatches out the action, and the action makes it here. Okay? You're going to see and hear that term dispatch a lot more. So I'm just telling you guys that now, but we will focus more on dispatch a little bit later. Not today, but down the road we'll be talking more about dispatch. Inside we have a switch statement. We use the action that was passed to us, and we check its type property. Remember, every action has to have a type property. That is the only requirement that an action has to have, is this type property. And that's to determine how we're going to update the state. Well, right now we don't know how we're going to update the state. So we're just going to put a default, and we're going to return the state unchanged. Okay? This is the pattern that every reducer is going to use. You could literally copy and paste this into every reducer you're going to build, and it'll be fine. There's only one thing that changes between reducers in this example. What do you guys think that one thing that would change is? Well, the code for this would stay the same. Yeah, I mean, different types that come through is going to change, but we don't have to change the code. What code here do you think we'd have to change?
State.
The default state. Whatever the default state, that's going to vary depending on what our reducer is for. But other than that, especially this part of the code, this never changes. Now we build into it and start making it different. But as far as boilerplate code goes, this is how you'll start every reducer. Whatever is returned from here becomes your new state. And it has to always return something, which is why if none of the action types ultimately end up matching, we just return whatever the existing state was unchanged. Because we always have to return an object from here. Inside of that index file, inside of reducers, we have to take all of our existing reducers and combine them into one reducer. To do that, we use a method called combine reducers that comes directly from the core Redux library. We import any reducer we have. In this case, we only have the one reducer. And then we call combine reducers, and we pass it an object. This object is essentially like blueprinting out what your state's going to look like. So whatever the clock reducer returns will be on a clock property inside of your state. So if we want to access whatever object this clock reducer returns, it'll be state.clock.whatever other properties are in there. I think current time was what's in there now. But whatever object that clock reducer returns, we access through the clock property on state. Now, if we change this to fluffy bunnies, then we would access it by state.fluffybunnies. Okay, so this is literally blueprinting out what your state object is going to look like. That makes sense? Somewhat? As much as it can right now? You have a question? Or?
Oh, no, I was just
stretching.
Sorry.
You're good.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
I'm a little confused about, so inside the combined reducers with the clock property, that's changing the state of the last slide?
No. So this is still just setup.
Oh, okay.
So we're taking this function and we're telling it to handle the clock property in state. And so this is like building the state initially.
Okay.
So whenever we dispatch a type that will affect the clock reducer, whatever it returns, we will access on the clock property. Yes.
So the clock property is victory.
Yes. Yeah. Like I said, and we're defining that here. And if we had more reducers, then we just define more properties that become part of the state, and then whatever reducer handles that piece of the state for us.
Yes. To go off what you were saying earlier, when you have more imports for the different reducers, like would it just be like one object with multiple properties, or would it be an object for each property?
Nope. So really good
just
question.
Like
so yeah, so we would just be building out this same object more. Like I said, and this object essentially becomes what your state's going to be. So it's not a. As far as the way you build it, it's a one-to-one. Whatever properties you put here, those are the properties that will be in your state. Okay, so you're essentially building what your state's going to look like right here. So behind the scenes, there's a little bit more to it than that, but not important for right now. Which brings me to an important side note. Redux does a lot of crap for you behind the scenes. Don't fret over it right now. Okay, just learn the steps, learn how to use it. Don't worry about all the inner workings and why and how stuff is working. Okay, learn the steps, learn how to kind of move around in it. Understanding will follow. And then plus, when you do want to learn more about it, you can either come to me and I'll be more than happy to explain it in deeper detail, or you can look at resources online. And after you've been using it and have some context for what you're doing, looking up a deeper understanding will make a lot more sense. Right now, if you try and look up a deeper understanding, yeah, you might learn a lot, but it's not going. You have nothing to connect it to because you don't know how to use it yet. I always learn how to use something first before I learn how to understand it, which might sound a little counterintuitive, but for programming, it's kind of the best way to go. Otherwise, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to figure out something that you've never used before, and you have no context for the inner workings of it when something's being described. After you've used it for a while, understanding is much easier because then you know what the hell it's talking about when it's talking about the reducer function and stuff like that. You're like, oh, I know the reducer function. That's the one that takes in the state object in my action and returns a new state. And then once you see how that actually ties into the whole Redux process under the hood, it'll make a lot more sense. Don't take that as I'm telling you guys to never understand what you're using. You should always understand what you're using. Just start by learning to use it first. All right. Finally, the last step for setting up Redux is we have to go into our main index file. The index file that's directly inside of the SRC folder. Up until now, we haven't touched this too much. All we've done in it is set up our routing in it a couple times, but other than that, we haven't done much of anything with it. Now, we're going to set up Redux in here. We have to import a couple things. We have to import the provider. Provider comes from React Redux and starts with a capital letter. So that probably means it's a what? It's a component. Okay? So it is some component that some nice person built that takes all the Redux functionality and connects it into a component called provider. And that is exactly what provider does. It's like a parent. It's like a loving parent providing you information. Okay? Create store. That one comes directly from Redux. It is just a method, and it is used to build your initial store. Remember, store is interchangeable for state. More properly, in Redux terms, it's called a store, though. Okay? I will call it both, just to kind of help bridge the gap, but it's properly called the Redux store. Okay? Here is that root reducer we built in the reducer's index file. We're going to break the root reducer down a little bit when we build it for real in a minute, and we're going to kind of break it down into a couple more steps to hopefully make it a little bit clearer what's happening with that. But here's that root reducer and our app component. We then wrap the provider around our whole application because we want our whole application to have access to the Redux store. Provider has a store property that takes our created store. So we pass store, create store, and we pass it the root reducer. For all intents and purposes, right at this point in time, create store just takes that one argument, which is our root reducer, and it builds us our state and our functionality for interacting with the Redux store / state. Down the road, we're going to learn about more arguments create store takes, but for now, it takes the one. And we're going to break this apart into a couple extra steps when we actually code it out as well. Now that we have Redux set up, how do we use Redux? How do we make use of all this crap we did? Well, we built this basic clock component. Everybody, this should look familiar to everybody at this point, just a basic class component. Nothing special yet. And then over in our app.js, we throw our clock component so we can see it on the screen. It was hopefully imported at the top of app.js, otherwise it wouldn't work. Any questions on this? Like I said, this part should be getting pretty familiar at this point, right? Component, render the component. First thing we're going to do, whenever we decide we're going to make a change to the Redux state, that means we need a couple things. We need an action creator. That action creator is going to return an action. Action has to have a type property. So usually the first thing we want to do is define a type for our action. So our types file is just going to hold an object, a bunch of key value pairs. Once again, it's just going to be strings. Okay? And we're going to define tick. Okay? So remember, tick is just the string tick. That's all it is. It's just a variable that's holding the string tick. So that was defined in action types.js. Inside of our actions index, where we're going to define all of our action creators, our functions that create each action object, we're going to import that types object from the types file. Okay? We're going to make a function called tick. This is our action creator. Okay? We're creating an action here. And it's returning an object that has that required type property. Very common mistake to make here is to put types because we have a types object. Very easy to confuse. Has to be type, no S. If you ever get the error in the console that your action doesn't have a type property, most likely it's because you put an S or you did just forget the type property. But Redux actually throws an error if your action doesn't have a type property. So it'll let you know. All right, and we're setting our types property to types.tick. Now, what does types.tick? What is that? A string tick. Okay, so we're essentially just putting the string tick right here. Okay, so this is just a function that returns an object. There's nothing more, nothing less to it. A function that returns an object. Action creator returning an action. In our reducer, we want to handle that tick action. So we need to define a case for it. So in case an action comes through with a type of types.tick, which is just a what? The string of tick. So if in case action.type is the string of tick, return this object. First thing we're doing is we're deconstructing the original state. So we're taking all the key value pairs inside the state and putting them into this object. Because we only want to change usually one or two properties. Okay, so we always need to destructure the state initially. Now here, it's actually not doing anything because our state only has one property. I'm not either. I'm not sure either. I'll turn that feature off. Keep doing that.
So, but if you wanted to change multiple things, you'd have to put that on the const up there as well. Like you just like list them all out.
All the initial properties, yes. You should have all the initial properties here, and then whatever you're changing, you update here.
So with the case types.tick, do you need the types.tick or can you just put tick?
You could put the string tick.
Just the tick?
Yep. We're actually going to do that the first time. We're going to do it with strings the first time just to show you guys. But once again, we don't do that because typos. And it sounds silly, but trust me, you'll put typos in it. You'll screw it up every time. So here we're resetting the current time property to a new date object. And then returning it into the Redux state. So that will update the state. So that is the full update process. Now we need to use all this stuff. So if you weren't confused before, hold on to your butts. All right. Whenever we have a component that wants to interact with the Redux state, either it wants to update the state or it wants to pull data from the state. It wants to use information from the state. Okay? Either one. It could be one or the other. It could be both. It could be anything. Anytime we need to connect a component to the Redux state, either to read or update it, we import connect from React Redux. Now it's coming from React Redux, but notice it's lowercase. Okay. This connect is a higher order component. No association to higher order functions, completely unrelated. But it is a higher order component. We will learn in much more detail what a higher order component is. You'll learn how to build higher order components. We're not there yet. Okay. On a very high level, a high order component takes in some information and takes in whatever component you're building. You see clock here. And it just wraps some functionality. It adds functionality onto your component. Okay. We'll talk more detail about that. I even think it's later this week. I think Friday we'll go into high order components. But don't get too caught up on that yet. We will explain it in more detail later. Right now, just this is the pattern we're using. So connects your component to either read from the Redux state or to update the Redux state. In this case, we're going to do both. Since we're updating the state, we need our action creator. So we import that little tick function that we made. Here, that tick function just returns an object. Okay, action creator returning an action. All right, we come down here and we have a bunch of weird stuff going on. First thing we have is this map state to props function. Anytime you need access to the Redux state, you want to pull data from the Redux state, you need map state to props. We pass map state to props into connect. Connect will call whatever function we pass it and give it to as the first argument. Notice we're not calling map state to props here, we're just passing the instructions in. When connect calls map state to props, it's going to pass you the entirety of the Redux state. It's going to say, here is everything that I have. Here's the whole Redux state. We could then pull whatever properties we want off of state, create a new object, and return that object. This object will ultimately get added directly onto our component's props. Okay? So this object that's returned from here will get added to our props. So if we want to access the time, it'll be this.props.time. If we change this property name, then it would change up here. This object gets directly added onto our props. Okay? You are literally mapping the state to the props. Okay? One day that name's going to click, and you guys are going to be like, oh, shit. Okay, so anytime you want access to the Redux state, you're pulling information from the state, you're reading information from the state, map state to props. First argument of connect, map state to props.
So just to clarify, because as you can see, it says state.clock.current time, and current time was part of the state from previously, so connect gives you access to that?
Gives you the whole Redux
Okay.
state. Okay. So if we look, where did all this come from? Clock, current time. This is all stuff we defined throughout our setup process. So if we look into our reducer, there's current time. That's where that property came from. And then we connected our reducer into state. The clock right here. So clock dot whatever this returns, in this case current time. So state dot clock dot current time. That's where all that comes from. Remember, this is a blueprint for what our state's going to look like. All right. And then the second argument of connect. First argument of connect is map state to props, and that's to pull information from the Redux state. If you're not pulling information from the Redux state, you can pass it null. Okay. So if you don't need map state to props, if all you're doing is updating the state, which will happen, you can pass connect null is the first argument. Second argument is an object that contains all of your action creators. So we imported tick, and then down here we create an object that has the property of tick set to the value of that tick function. Okay. When I write this out for you guys moving forward, I will actually write it out in full object literal notation. I won't do the collapsy thing because I know it can be confusing. I just did it in the slides to fit it. Okay, but remember when you just do curly brackets, that's the same as saying create a tick property set to the value of whatever this variable is holding. In this case, it's holding a function. All right, and then notice that is calling connect right there. Open paren, close paren. It takes two arguments. Map state to props to access the state, and then an object for updating the state. All of our action creators go here. So action creators are the second argument. And then we're doing what looks like a second call and passing it in our component. It's a little deceptive here of what this is actually doing. We are not calling connect a second time. Connect returns a function that we're immediately calling and passing at clock. Okay? So we're calling connect, passing it essentially some configuration information. Connect is then returning a function, and we're immediately calling that function it returns with our component. There's a name for this. Does anybody know what the name for it is? Query. I didn't know that for the longest time. Hey, do you know about currying? Never heard of it. You know when a function returns a function, you call it? Oh, yeah. There's a lot of things you'll learn to do and not know there's a name for it. So now that we have everything all connected together, we can actually use all of our information. Remember, this object gets added to our props. So to access whatever the current time is, we just say this.props.time. If we change this name here, then it would be whatever. If we change this once again to fluffy bunnies, then it would be this.props.fluffy bunnies. Whatever we return from here gets added directly onto our props. Along with this object that holds our action creators. That also gets added directly onto our props. So to access it, to call one of the action creators, it's now on our props. So we say this.props.tick, which will now call that action creator, return the object that is our action, pass it to the reducer, on and on and on. So very important here. We can't just call tick without passing it to connect and then calling it from props. If we just called tick directly, not the version that's on props, if we just said tick and call it, what's going to happen? Let's look at the definition of what tick was one more time. So if we call tick, what's it going to do? Just return an object. It's going to do exactly what we told it to. Don't overthink it. It's just a function that returns an object. If it's not connected into Redux, it is a completely useless function. Okay? The only thing that gives it meaning is that we passed it through connect. Connect plugs it into the Redux craziness and actually makes it do something. So you can't just call your action creators directly, because if you do, you're just calling a function that returns an object to nowhere.
With this.props.tick function, does that call the switch statement with the case?
Ultimately, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what the difference is when we do it this way, it takes the object that tick returns and passes it through the reducers. Okay? And then it'll update the state accordingly. If you don't call it from props, then it's just a function returning an object, which will do you absolutely no good. All right, and then of course we're calling this in a set interval every 1 second, so we can see our clock tick. That's it. You guys all know Redux now. It's that easy. So take a quick break. Let your minds relax for a minute before we do it for reals. So as soon as you get back, we're going to walk through building that. We're going to break a couple things down a little bit further to hopefully add a little more clarity. I do not expect any one of you to understand this today. I'll be surprised if any of you understand it the next week. Redux is extremely difficult and scary, okay? Just got to keep pushing through it, though. It will make sense eventually, and when it does click, you'll laugh at surprisingly how easy it actually is. But it is a lot at first. But I promise it does make sense, and it will save you time. But don't beat yourself up for not understanding it right now.
Yeah.